calibration. A very popular and a good measure in my way of thinking is skin fold measurements. Skin fold measures uses a caliper, and now there are many of those that are relatively inexpensive. They measure your subcutaneous fat and use this to predict your total percent body fat, which is a good indicator. It's fat under the skin. In a skin fold measure, which are fairly accurate and you can learn to do yourself and you can learn to do them at home. While the caliper shown here is quite expensive, there are some inexpensive ones. It's a relatively easy skill to learn, and with practice you can get pretty good at it. It is accessible. You can do it in your home with an inexpensive caliper, and it estimates percent body fat. There are many different sites that are used, and there are a few common equations, and typically men and women use different skin fold sites, but the common sites include the triceps, as shown in this picture, the abdominal skin fold, the iliac crest skin fold, the thigh skin fold, the chest skin fold, and the calf skin fold. Different skin fold measurements, as listed here, are used for different sexes, males and females, and sometimes different age groups, and so you probably wouldn't be taking all of those for one particular formula, but you might use all of them to use several different formulas so that you get more than one estimate. You want to check with your instructor and your textbook about more details on these measures. I've shown here some of the research calipers, those in the top of the picture that cost several $100s, on down to the less expensive calipers, which cost from $5 to $10. And these many kinds of calipers all work. Obviously, the more expensive ones are better. They're used for research purposes, but the home use calipers can be quite accurate if you learn how to use them properly, and they're quite inexpensive. Now that we've talked about skin fold measurements, let's talk about anthropometric measurements for a minute. One of the very common ones is a waist-to-hip ratio. It's very easy to use, and I encourage you to use this as well as your body mass index and skin fold measurements. Also, you can use circumference measures, anthropometric measurements, to estimate your body fat. The waist-to-hip ratio is just simply to measure the circumference of your waist, measure the circumference of your hips, and divide the circumference of your hips into your waist. People who have a smaller waist size and hip size are at much less risk than those people who have a big waist. Some people believe that just taking the waist measurement itself is a pretty good indicator of risk. You can also use body circumferences such as the waist and the hips combined with height and weight to actually predict percent body fat. I would caution you that these are not as accurate as skin fold measurements, and I would prefer skin fold measurements to those used. Bioelectrical impedance has now been perfected to a much greater extent in the past, involves a special machine, but they're much less expensive than they used to be. They are now becoming more accurate. It does require this special machine, but is now more practical. And this is a picture of one of those particular devices. And it would be important, if you're going to use this, to use the same machine consistently, because one of the problems with these is calibration, and if you use a different machine, you may get different results.